Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to finish Chapter 16, World War II. We're going to look at Part 6, Allied Victory. The first thing we're going to look at is the Grand Alliance. Well, the United States is now involved in World War II. It took an attack by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor to abandon its isolationism. The America First movement collapsed the next day, and hundreds of thousands of Americans volunteered to join the military, as we discussed in the last section. But now with America in the war, it created a Grand Alliance, a term that Churchill came up with. It was the alliance of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. Here we see Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill at one of their conferences. Now, one of the things they did was they demanded unconditional surrender of Germany. Basically, this would assure a mutual trust with the Soviet Union. You know, before this, the Soviet Union actually had signed a treaty with Germany, if you remember. And now, of course, after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, they were no longer, of course, part of that. But there's been a lot of distrust between, the West, Britain and America, and the communist Soviet Union. So now, these two groups are going to have to work together. And by demanding an unconditional surrender of Germany, Hitler would not be able to divide the Allies. And this is something they wanted to make sure Stalin understood. Now, one of the things that becomes very important is the industrial capabilities of the three powers would be overwhelming. Here we see an American factory building American bombers. Here we have a Russian tank factory building Russian tanks. So and of course the Americans used, like everyone else, used women to produce weapons. So this is going to produce an industrial capability that would just be overwhelming. The United States would actually be able to build more weapons than all the other countries put together. I mean, it did help a lot that there was no war here, so that our factories could keep producing weapons without, any problems with being bombed or attacked. Now, Stalin calls on nationalism to unite the Soviet Union, not communism. In fact, they refer to World War II as the Great Patriotic War. They're all going to come together to defeat Nazism, Germany. So they don't really refer to communism. That's not the thing that's going to unite them. It's going to be their patriotism, love of Russia. Now, the combined military power of the Allies fought back on all fronts. And that's what we're going to cover today. Now, in 1942, the war continues in Europe. All right. It started in 1939 with the German invasion of Poland and has been going on. The Germans are still fighting in Russia. Operation Barbarossa was a failure, but they're still there. And this is going to lead in 1942 to the biggest battle and most pivotal battle of the war, the Battle of Stalingrad. Went from August 23rd, 1942 to February 3rd, 1943, 199 days. Now, Hitler wants to capture the Russian city of Stalingrad. He really didn't need it, but it was named after Joseph Stalin, and it was kind of a thing he wanted to take it. And Stalin, because it was named after him, did not want the Germans to have it. So both sides fed lots of men and materials into this huge battle. All right, the biggest battle in human history. Now, in the end, the Russians are able to surround Stalingrad. The Germans had actually captured, 80 to 90% of the city. So the Russians actually surround it and trap the German army inside Stalingrad. Now, they want to break out, but Hitler refuses to let them escape. It's, Stalingrad is his city now. Here we see German soldiers fighting around the city. Most of the city had been destroyed, but through bombings and shelling, so there was a lot of rubble. The Russians, you can see they're wearing white camouflage to kind of blend in. It kind of works there. You don't really even see the guy on the left side of the picture. Here are more Russian soldiers fighting through the rubble. They fought a lot in factories, and it was both sides, high death rate. But as the winter comes in and the Germans start suffering, by February of 1943, they're cut off. They don't have supplies of food, ammunition, medical supplies. They were actually issued just summer clothing because they didn't really expect the battle to go beyond October. So it just becomes so intolerable for the German soldiers, they're forced to surrender. Here we see one of the Russian soldiers with a German prisoner. The battle, as I said, lasted 199 days, and the Germans, the Axis forces, because there were Italians and Romanian forces there too, suffered 850,000 casualties. Now, 96,000 German soldiers surrender at Stalingrad and become prisoners of war, and only 8,000 would ever see Germany again. The Soviets kept them for 10 years after the war, and many of them in work camps, and as you can see, only 8,000 of the 96 ever came home. Now, the Soviet military losses were very high too, 750,000, some say as many as 1 million. But it is a major defeat for Germany and a turning point in the war in Europe. For the next 2.5 years, Germany would fight a brutal defensive war against the Soviet Union and what would be called the Russian Front. Now we're going to talk about North Africa and Southern Europe. Now, the Axis and Allied forces had been fighting in North Africa since 1940. I mentioned earlier how Italy invaded Egypt and was thrown back by a small British force, very humiliating. The Germans had to send in eventually Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and a small German force known as the Afrika Korps, and they will push the British back into Egypt. But they stopped right outside, about 16 miles west of Cairo. And in a very large pivotal battle known as the Battle of El Alamein in 1942, the British will defeat the Germans. Their 8th Army is led by one of their best generals, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Churchill called it the hinge of fate that opened the door to Allied victories. Now, the British would push the Germans west through North Africa into Tunisia. We see here on the map, to Tobruk, Benghazi, El Agheila, up to Tripoli, the capital of Libya, and into Tunisia. And while they're being chased by Montgomery and the 8th Army, the US and the British invade in 1943 in Northwest Africa, trapping the Axis, the Italians and the Germans. Now, the Axis in North Africa are ultimately forced to surrender, losing Africa. Roosevelt and Churchill get together and they pick Dwight D. Eisenhower to command all the Allied forces in Europe. Not the Soviets, but just the British, the Americans, the Canadians, the Free French, and all the other Allied forces, everyone but the Soviet Union. Now, the French pro-German Vichy government, which was in control of Northwest Africa, chose not to fight back against the Americans and British when they landed. And this really made Hitler very angry. He retaliated and moved his troops into southern France, known as Vichy France. The Allies next invade and capture Sicily. Mussolini, by this time, after suffering so many losses, the people of Italy, even his own friends, turned against him. The King of Italy dumped him as prime minister. He was actually arrested, and Italy will join the Allies. Mussolini was placed under arrest, but he was rescued by the Germans. They had a daring plan. He was being kept in some hilltop resort, and they actually flew glider planes in, got him and got him back, and he was actually placed in power in northern Italy. But basically, he was going to be a puppet of whatever Hitler told him to do. The Allies next invade Italy. I'm going to show you here on the map. First, we went from North Africa to Sicily. And then from there, they moved into Italy. Here we see pictures of American Sherman tanks coming off an LST. LSTs, known as Landing Ship Tanks, were these ships you see here. They had large doors in the front. They would go up onto the shore. They would open the doors, a ramp would come out. This way, large vehicles like tanks and artillery, trucks, jeeps can be transported to invasion areas. My uncle was actually an executive officer on one of these LSTs, 375, though I only have one picture of that, and I'll show you that later on. Here are some more of the LSTs. This is at Salerno, where they're unloading equipment. And this here also, it's at Salerno. Salerno is one of the two places they invaded. They invaded later on at Anzio. It was a slow defensive war. The Germans do a great job defending Italy. It's very mountainous and it's not very wide. It's about 150 miles at its widest point. So it's very easy for the Germans to set up defensive lines. And the Allies really have a tough time advancing up the peninsula. They thought it would be easy, and it was not. Ooh, look who's going behind us there. Hi, sweetheart.
Hi, hon.
It's my AP class. You want to say hi?
Hi, guys.
That was hello. She's going to make dinner. Now in June, the Allies capture Rome. Here we see them driving their tanks, being cheered as they go past the iconic Colosseum. Now we're going to talk about the Battle of the Atlantic. Now, just like World War I, Germany wanted to starve Britain by sinking merchant ships bringing supplies with submarine warfare, the U-boats. Here we see a American or Allied ship that's been torpedoed and sinking in the Atlantic. But to protect the merchant ships, the Allies grouped them into convoys. Up there she goes again. And the Allies used technology to start sinking the U-boats. And by 1943, more U-boats are being sunk than it can be made. There was new technology like sonar that ships on the surface could find them. And also the Germans broke the secret German Enigma code. This allowed them to know exactly where the German U-boats were. With this, they were able to turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, and now troops and military supplies streamed to Britain. Britain is going to become like the fortress island in Europe. Now, there was an air war going on over Germany. Now, the Luftwaffe never really rebounded after their loss at the Battle of Britain. And now the Allies, the British and the Americans, who have much better bombers, 4-engine bombers, like here you see the B-17 Flying Fortress, probably the best 4-engine bomber built in the war. The Germans never had anything like this. And the Americans and the British have a lot of them. And they start to bomb Germany. The plan, they have two parts. One is to destroy Germany's ability to produce weapons. Now it gets dry here. And two, to break the Germans' people's will to fight back, their morale, to break them down and not want it to go on fighting. In fact, the British came up with a plan to kill the factory workers and destroy their homes. The British felt that if you destroy factories, they can just be rebuilt. You kill the workers, and then you could really stop production. There were large-scale bombing raids, and they just leveled German cities and killed thousands of civilians. In July of 1943, the British and U.S. bombed Hamburg, that's the second biggest city in Germany, over 7 nights. The bombing is so intense, it causes a firestorm. This is like a fire tornado. It kills about 42,600 civilians and damaged about 80% of the city. The Nazi leadership was shocked when they heard and saw the damage there. Here we see a photograph showing many of the bodies that were killed at Hamburg. Berlin is bombed 314 times in the war. 90% of the city is destroyed. In February of 1945, the British and American bombers hit Dresden. A large firestorm there kills 25,000 civilians. Here we see the American B-17s dropping bombs over Dresden, and the damage was unbelievable. Now we're going to lead to the end of the war, the defeat of Germany. And we're going to start with June 6, 1944, D-Day. the British and Americans' invasion of Normandy, France. It's been referred to by the American leaders as the Day of Days, or the longest day. It was the biggest day, the most crucial day of the war. This was the day the Americans and British were going to land in France and then drive east toward Germany to ultimately defeat them. Now, Germany had built large fortifications along the French coast called the Atlantic Wall. All right, some of these guns were huge. They were meant to fire on American, British naval vessels. Now, the shortest spot here, you can see, let's see if I can show you here, is right here. That's where the Germans figured the Allies would invade, because it's the shortest spot between England and Calais, France. But Eisenhower knows that, and he decides not to go there, but to actually invade at Normandy. It was further away, but not as heavily defended. We had paratroopers, British and American ones, drop behind the lines in the dark the night before. Here we see American landing crafts coming ashore at Omaha Beach. Omaha Beach had the worst casualties of the day. It was referred to as Bloody Omaha. Here we see British soldiers coming ashore at two of the beaches, Gold Beach or Sword Beach, and the Canadians coming ashore at Juno. These were code names for the beaches in France. Omaha, Utah for the Americans, Golden Sword for the British, and Juno for the Canadians. Here we see some British soldiers with some German prisoners. And here's my uncle's ship, LST 375. This was at Omaha Beach. He came in the next day where they unloaded American soldiers and vehicles. In fact, there were a lot of LSTs unloading a lot of equipment. All right, you can see the beaches here at Omaha, just so many trucks and jeeps and tanks and men coming ashore. The D-Day invasion was a success, and it does start a second front against Germany. Now the Germans will have to defend against the Allies in the west and the south and the Soviets in the east. Now the Allies fight across France. In August, Paris is liberated. The Germans are unable to stop the Allies moving across France into Germany. Most of the French people come out throwing flowers, cheering for the Americans. After all these years of occupation, they're just finally so happy to be free of the Germans. Now this is going to lead to the biggest battle in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. December 16th, 1944 to January 25th, 1945. The Germans are going to make one last major offensive to push the Allies back. Hitler feels they still have enough troops and tanks to do this. One of the things they didn't have was gasoline, and that's going to become a problem later. So they make a winter offensive through the Ardennes forest. They use the last of their reserve forces. And here we see a map. You can see the blue line is the Allies are on the left, the Germans are on the right. So they make this offensive in there. You see that one little circle, that was the Belgian town of Bastogne. They do not surrender, and the Germans are not able to capture it, which slows down their advance. They continue on. You can see here where they, this is the furthest they got. This is why the battle was actually nicknamed the Battle of the Bulge. The newspapermen saw it on a map and gave it this nickname, and that kind of stuck. The Americans were calling it the counteroffensive, but Battle of the Bulge stuck. The Germans do well at first, but the Americans here at Bastogne really do a great job holding on. Eventually, Patton's forces from the south, Montgomery's forces from the north, push down and start to close off that bulge, and the Germans who start running out of gasoline are forced to stop and pull back. So also the air clears up. Allied planes can now attack German forces on the ground. The Germans start running out of gas. They're forced to retreat. So the Americans regroup and they defeat the Germans. The Germans now have nothing left. They cannot stop the Allies from pushing into Germany. Eisenhower, though, once they get across the Rhine River, they do capture a bridge at Remagen, and they're able to get across. Many people expect them to drive toward Berlin, but Eisenhower decides not to go after Berlin. He's going to let the Soviets do it. The Soviets said they want to have the honor and the glory of capturing Berlin. They've been fighting the Soviets, the Germans, since 1941, and they've suffered terribly. And Eisenhower realizes the Germans are going to put up a really good fight to defend Berlin. So why, if the Soviets are very happy to go in there and have their men die to capture Berlin, Eisenhower figures, go right ahead. He's going to save American and British lives. So the Americans focus on capturing southern Germany, Bavaria, and Austria. The Americans, though, stop on the Elbe River. Here we see this famous photograph showing American and Soviet soldiers meeting on a bombed-out bridge on the Elbe River, coming together to shake hands. It was, I guess, a photo moment here. Now, the Soviets push west. Since Germany's defeated Stalingrad, the Soviets have been pushing the Germans back, and they eventually, in November of 1944, they enter Germany. On July 29th, Soviet troops reach the outskirts of Warsaw. Now, this is going to lead to the Warsaw Uprising. This is different from the one we talked about in the Holocaust section. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This is an uprising by the what they call the Home Army of Poland, the Polish Home Army. On July 31st, these were secret partisan soldiers, and they started an uprising against the Germans in Warsaw. They see the Soviet soldiers are just right outside the city, and they figured they're going to move right in, and they're going to link up with them, and it'll be, all of them working together to defeat the Germans in Warsaw. They do a very good job here. They see him captured one of the German half-tracks flying a Polish flag. Most of them were just civilians with rifles fighting back. Some of them had captured. A lot of them were wearing German uniforms, German helmets, because this is what they captured. But they were fighting back against the Germans. And they expected, the Soviets to come in there and help them. In 4 days, they do take control of Warsaw, but the Soviet Red Army doesn't help them. Stalin orders his army to stop and not help. So the German army circles Warsaw and starts to retake the city. Here we see the German SS soldiers fighting their way into the city, and most of the Polish Home Army is killed, and 90% of the Warsaw is destroyed. So, as I said here, October 2nd, 63 days later, the uprising is crushed and 85% of the city is destroyed. The SS troops come in and they actually murder up to 200,000 Polish civilians in retaliation. Churchill wanted to help the Poles by dropping supplies into the city. Stalin said no, but Churchill did it anyway. Now, they actually unveiled a Warsaw Uprising monument in 1989. The year is interesting because that was the year that the communism, the Berlin Wall, so-called the fall of communism, occurs, and Poland becomes a free nation away from communism. And one of the things they chose to honor is the uprising. So they built this memorial once the communist government was out of Poland. Now, why did Stalin do this? Stalin wanted a communist government in Poland after the war, so he wanted to remove anyone who might oppose him. And the Home Army, which obviously was did a very good job of standing up to the SS and actually was able to defeat the Germans in Warsaw, these were not the people that Stalin wanted around, because he wanted to be able to take over and didn't want anyone to oppose him or give him any trouble. So he was very happy to sit back and let the Germans wipe them out, do his dirty work for him, so to speak. And then he moved into Warsaw, defeated the Germans that were there, and then liberated the city. So Stalin, in the end, will get what he wants. Now, August 20th, the Soviet troops enter Romania. Romania switched sides. They had, joined the Axis powers early on. So they switched sides and they joined the Soviets. In September 24th, Soviet troops enter Czechoslovakia. Here we see driving into Prague, one of the Soviet tanks, and you have a lot of happy people riding on the tanks. They're not going to be very happy in another year after the Soviets decide they're not leaving Czechoslovakia. On October 10th, the Soviets move in and capture Warsaw. Again, the Polish civilians are out there cheering for them. And they, again, as we discussed during the Cold War, will not be cheering when the Soviets don't leave Poland either. Now, by the 23rd of November, the Soviet Red Army enters the border, crosses the border into Germany. And now they'll start pushing west towards Berlin. During this time, Germany is also losing badly at the Battle of the Bulge. Now, the last section we're going to talk about is the fall of Berlin. By April of 1945, the Soviets surround Berlin. April 20th, they actually complete the surrounding the city. It's also Hitler's birthday, his 56th birthday, so there's a celebration down in the bunker, and the Soviets decide to join the celebration by firing artillery shells toward the Chancellery where Hitler was down below. Now the Germans are going to defend Berlin with old men and young children. Some of the SS soldiers were no more than 14 years old. Here we have this 12-year-old boy who received the Iron Cross from Hitler for destroying a Soviet tank. So, luckily, some of the German soldiers, the young boys, were captured. Here we have 2 that were captured by the Americans, so they survived. 7,000 of those children died defending Berlin. Also, middle-aged and older men. The things that you see them over their shoulder, these are called Panzerfaust. It's an anti-tank weapon that could fire and destroy tanks. So these men would be taught how to fire them. Grandpa here, who's being shown how to fight back against the Russian tanks. Yes, we have to even show Mom how to do it. Now the Soviets push into Berlin block by block, getting closer and closer to the center of Berlin. Now Adolf Hitler remains in the Führer bunker beneath the Chancellery. On April 30th, the Soviets captured the Reichstag. Now the Reichstag had been an empty shell since the Reichstag fire in 1933. The Nazis never rebuilt it. But the Soviets used it as their focal point and eventually capturing it. And this was the iconic picture of a Soviet soldier holding the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. The Chancellery is actually further in the back where that smoke is. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler marries his longtime girlfriend, Eva Braun. They have a little wedding celebration. Then they go into their private room in the bunker, and they both kill themselves. So that's it. Hitler is dead. This here is his body. The body of the both of them was supposedly brought up to the courtyard outside the Chancellery, above the bunker, where their bodies were cremated. But the world suddenly got, the word Hitler was dead. Now, on April 28th, 2 days beforehand, Mussolini was captured and shot. They hung his body along with his girlfriend and a number of his other cohorts from a gas station in, I believe this was Milan. Hitler saw this or heard about this, and that's why he ordered to have his body burned. He did not want the Russians, to be hanging his body up. Now, May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. War in Europe is over. This is known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. Here we see Buckingham Palace. There's the King and Queen waving, King George VI and his wife Elizabeth. And of course, right in the middle is Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The woman, she's actually a teenage girl, off to the left there, is actually the current Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, who just celebrated her, I think, 93rd birthday. Here we have Times Square, celebration, VE Day. Everyone is happy, victory in Europe. Of course, we still had Japan, but it was just happy that Europe was done. Now, victory in the Pacific. In the Pacific, the Americans defeated the Japanese on island after island. We were talking about in the last section about how they were going after island hopping, going after one island, leaving the more heavily defended ones behind. But they kept closer and getting closer to Japan. But the Japanese do not surrender easily. They fight to the death. We talked about the Banzai charges, the suicidal charges. As they got closer, the Japanese start using these kamikaze flights. These pilots would fly their planes with the weapons and the bombs on board and just fly them right into American ships. This would cause a lot of deaths, damage. Here we have the USS Franklin that was in the Pacific that was hit by a number of kamikazes and did sink. When I was a young kid, I remember I knew a man who actually was a sailor on board the Franklin, and his arms were terribly burned. He still had the scars. So it was really tough. The Japanese were not going to surrender easily. There were terrible battles on the Philippines. Here we have MacArthur coming ashore, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. So every island, as they got closer and closer to Japan, became a bigger battle. This is the iconic raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi and Iwo Jima. But the Americans knew that invading Japan was going to be a lot of casualties. So in August of 1945, American planes dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. They will destroy 2 Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. President Truman believes that dropping the atomic bombs can end the war without invading Japan and save millions of lives, not just American lives, but Japanese lives too. They estimated that maybe up to 10 million Japanese would die in the fighting, as the Japanese were preparing even children to fight back against the American soldiers. So on August 6th at 8:15 in the morning, a single B-29 dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Here we can see the devastation in the city. This building here was like a conference center, and you can see how much damage. The Japanese left it there. Today it's actually known as the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. This is exactly the way it looked after the bombing. 80,000 died in a flash, and maybe up to, they estimate, 200,000 died later on. Then on August 8th, another B-29 dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. 40,000 died in a flash here. Japan surrenders. VJ Day. The war is over. 56 million lives lost. Here is Admiral Chester Nimitz signing the surrender papers that Japan is surrendering. It was on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. All right, that ends our section on World War II. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend. All right, so I'll see you on Monday. We're going to have I think we have a Zoom meeting tomorrow, though, actually. Later today, I should say. We have a Zoom meeting, yes, at 1 o'clock. I'll be talking to you today at 1 o'clock. All right? So talk to you later. Bye-bye.